Some old video games have been burned into our emotional memories like a favorite song. But what if those memories are more vivid, more detailed than the game itself? Was Delta Force, for instance, truly a pixel-perfect masterpiece, or are we misremembering a classic? Is it possible our childhood imaginations might have enhanced the graphics of games from our past? Let's see if reality can live up to the legends, or if nostalgia has been playing tricks on us. Going back to the original Delta Force now, I gotta say I did not remember it being so pixely. Which is fair enough, the game is from 1998 and when you consider the sizes and resolutions of monitors back then, it makes sense. Delta Force is one of the granddaddies of tactical shooters, if not the granddaddy. A military simulation game where you can take out enemies in 1 or 2 hits. And the same can happen to you. So you'll need to get used to hearing this report a lot.
Bravo is down. Bravo is down. Bravo is down.
Bravo is down. Bravo is down.
And I mean a lot. It's part of the Delta Force experience package, I fear, but more on that later, let's not get ahead of ourselves. The visuals in Delta Force are a bit difficult to get into nowadays. This is definitely one of those situations where our memories of the game are much higher res than the actual reality of the game. And this is to be expected to a certain extent. It's one of those aspects that is not talked about when people use the nostalgia goggles metaphor. Some old titles have been recorded in our emotional memories as we imagine them while playing them as kids and teenagers, and imagination tends to enhance things. This may be one of those cases.
Blackwood to King 6. Bravo is down. Mission abort.
Nothing inherently wrong with what's on screen, just that things look way pixelier and lacking in foliage than my memories of the game are. The game is limited to resolutions up to 800 by 600, but there is a quick workaround that will allow you to run the game in 1024 by 768, even if this creates a weird format issue when recording footage, as you might have noticed already. You need to modify the df.cfg file in your installation folder. Open it with any text editor like Notepad and change the game _res and max _res to 5. Don't forget to save the file, and now when you boot up the game, you should have the 1024 by 768 resolution. Enjoy. The general lack of foliage makes sense when you consider most missions tend to take place in some kind of desert. You have brown desert, yellow desert, white desert, and the always fascinating green desert when on a night mission. The graphics, however, tend to fade away because of the very real tension you feel during each mission. When you can die from one stray shot and cannot save the game at any point during a mission, this makes every combat encounter that much more stressful. The sound design contributes to this tense vibe, hearing enemy weapons being fired and bullets whizzing all over the place, ricocheting off of who knows what, alongside the occasional enemy yell. Things can get quite intense. Gameplay is really straightforward, as you'd expect from a decades-old pioneer, though I suggest you start with configuring your keys because, much like Project Iggy, another tactical shooter I have already covered, Delta Force comes from the pre-WASD standard era, so the default movement keys are assigned to the arrow keys, and you'll probably want to change those. That said and done, you can rename your operative and go and choose your first mission. The game gives you a surprising amount of choice in terms of the missions you can undertake. There are 5 major world regions, each featuring a couple of beginner missions, which will unlock further ones once you start successfully completing them. Each world location has its own story arc, but you don't get locked into any of them. So if and when a mission is giving you a hard time, you can always attempt one from a different region.
Bravo is down. All units abort. All units abort.
Despite the game's age, I was surprised by the very hand-holdy nature of the checkpoint directions. Though I did need to use some actual brain power when I saw the initial map prep because they did not skimp on the text descriptions of who, what and where, which is great for immersion purposes and also to gain a better understanding of the actual narratives happening in the background. You need to at least skim through these because some missions have other goals than simply eliminating all the hostiles. For instance, you'll be tasked to find a laptop or destroy some antennas. These things are explained in the mission briefings but will not be mentioned during the mission per se. unless you directly access the mission briefing text by pressing O. The mission briefing will tell you where you can expect resistance, and that's great, and when you're on a mission, the map feature will not only display the checkpoints but also the movement of enemies and friendlies in real time, so always look at the map to not be caught with your pants down. The Delta Force maps are open. You can go off script, as it were. Sure, there is not much to see or do, but having that freedom of going towards the horizon with the open sky above you and no hallways and doors requiring varyingly colored keys to be opened was an experience like no other up until that time. And trying to relay that now through words and footage might sound like I'm overselling it if you're a viewer born in the second millennium, because why would something not be an open world? And might sound like I'm underselling it to viewers who are my age and older. It was special. It was a sign of developing processing power and of the medium of video games evolving with it. Back to the game though. You have a limited amount of gear you can take with you, a primary weapon, a sidearm, and a choice between extra ammo or various extra equipment. Missions have default loadouts, however you can change these, and the M4 seems to be the best overall choice, thanks to its rapid rate of fire and the presence of a scope. The screen featuring the zoomed in circle of the scope cementing itself as the most iconic visual of the game. What set Delta Force aside from preceding first-person shooters was that its bullets were actual objects with simulated ballistics, meaning you had to take into account things like distance from the target. This wasn't as advanced as modern day possibilities, of course, but for the time, this was extremely fascinating. The ballistics seem to be mainly limited to not being a hit scan and featuring spread, with the latter seeming to be fairly random, except when it comes to the enemies, and I'll get into that right now. Another point where the game shines when compared to other similar titles of the time is how the difficulty rating very directly affects the behavior of the AI. Instead of either spawning more enemies and or making them harder to kill, the Delta Force AI will get better the higher the difficulty setting. It will get better at shooting at you, meaning its bullet spread will be reduced, and it will get better at reacting to your activity through the use of more advanced tactics when fighting. This is also where I should talk about the sound effects in the game, because the enemy voices are absolutely hilarious. I seriously doubt this was the intention, but it kinda happened because of the execution, and even though repetitive, they're funny to listen to.
Tenemos un problema.
¿Qué está pasando acá?
The maps themselves are unfortunately somehow the weakest part of the game when looking at it now in retrospect. As I mentioned earlier, mainly consisting of differently colored deserts, they not only show signs of deforestation, even when considering these are dry regions, but due to the sparseness of vegetation, they're also some of the worst tactical insertion points possible. You're usually 200 to 300 meters from your target, so everyone can hear the helicopter and most likely also see it from a long distance without any sort of foliage cover. This kinda takes down the immersion score a bit, however the devs might have been also aware of this problem and set a bunch of the missions as night missions, which possibly spawned the second most familiar images of Delta Force, namely the green night vision screen. This addition kinda balances out the earlier mentioned lack of foliage. What is present and possible on the maps though is a fair bit of things you can interact with, meaning you can shoot at the very few trees and eventually they will break apart, and you can also shoot at other things such as birds, which you can take down, as well as enemy floodlights, which will make it a bit easier to approach them. The single player aspect of the game was the bulk of the experience the majority of video games offered back then, and this made sense for a plethora of reasons. However, starting with the mid to late 90s, online multiplayer features began to pop up in more and more titles that could benefit from them. And if there was anything that would be cool to play with friends or randos, it would be a tactical shooter game where you can die in one hit. The game offered you the opportunity of playing through the campaign missions with a co-op approach, as well as the more traditional multiplayer modes. It can be argued that what cemented Delta Force as a major title was its multiplayer. Introducing the concept of an open world to a gameplay format that had been dominated by the same-ish corridors ever since id let hell loose on Mars back in '93 was a major shakeup for the status quo. Delta Force was not the only game that did this, that much is true. Rainbow Six and Ghost Recon need to be mentioned in the same breath, but Delta Force did become one of the most popular titles in my Eastern European neck of the woods during the internet cafe phase of the late 90s, early 2000s. This happened because the game also had LAN multiplayer, of course, and this meant entire friend groups could go and play together, or against each other, or with random people from the internet cafe. Many a friendship was struck this way. Delta Force enjoyed a fairly positive critical response at release and was financially successful enough to receive a direct sequel the following year in 1999. This proved to be the start of a long string of Delta Force games being released up until 2009, the series boasting a total of 9 titles. In 2023, a Delta Force reboot of sorts was announced. This new game would be called Delta Force Hawk Ops and was expected to release sometime during 2024. How many of you have played the original Delta Force or any other Delta Force title? Let me know in the comments and consider subscribing, help me get to a gajillion.